Entonces, buenos días a todos. Mi parte de la presentación va a versar sobre los aspectos básicos, los antecedentes de lo que se conoce como ABS por sus siglas en inglés, o el tercer objetivo del Convenio de Diversidad Biológica, la participación justa y equitativa de los beneficios que se derivan de su utilización. Dominique se va a enfocar en la parte de nuestra charla que tiene que ver con el estado actual de las negociaciones sobre secuenciamiento genético. Entonces, repito, yo les doy unos antecedentes para que entendamos cómo se llegó a ese tema del DSI, el secuenciamiento genético bajo la convención. Piensen que la preocupación cuando se estaba negociando la Convención de Biodiversidad era que los países en desarrollo, principales proveedores de recursos genéticos, sentían que los países desarrollados se estaban llevando sus riquezas genéticas, sus recursos, y estaban haciendo maravillas con eso, y que los países de origen de esos recursos genéticos no estaban recibiendo nada a cambio. Recuerden, sí, importante que antes del Convenio de Diversidad Biológica, la biodiversidad era patrimonio común de la humanidad, era de todo el mundo, decía el derecho internacional. No es sino cuando se adopta el Convenio de Diversidad Biológica que se dice que la biodiversidad es del que la tiene. Es decir, se da la soberanía de los recursos a cada país, de sus recursos a cada país. Entonces, repito, la preocupación era esa. Se están llevando estos recursos y nosotros no sabemos, o sea, los países de origen no reciben nada a cambio. Y es por eso, como lo vimos en la primera charla, para los que nos acompañaron en esa oportunidad, que el convenio establece ese tercer objetivo. Queremos una participación justa y equitativa de los beneficios que se deriven de la utilización sostenible de los recursos genéticos. Piensen que básicamente yo suelo decir en clase, aunque esto no sé qué tan bien traduce, pero es básicamente los países en desarrollo diciendo el CBY nuestro, el cómo vamos ahí, cómo vamos nosotros en esa explotación de los recursos genéticos, queremos nuestra parte de los beneficios que se derivan de esa utilización. Y entonces, con esa preocupación en mente y con ese contexto, el Convenio de Diversidad Biológica acuerda, es decir, establece el artículo 15, que dice lo siguiente: como la biodiversidad es del que la tiene, los estados son absolutamente soberanos de regular el acceso a los recursos genéticos como quieran. Es decir, los países pueden, a través de sus legislaciones, determinar cómo se hace ese acceso a los recursos genéticos. Vamos a ver cómo Colombia toma esa oportunidad recién ratificado el Convenio de Diversidad Biológica y regulamos el acceso a los recursos genéticos en el país. Entonces, el primer componente del artículo 15 es: cada país podrá regular el acceso a sus recursos genéticos. Luego el artículo continúa diciendo: si el país quiere, podrá exigir un consentimiento informado previo para el acceso a los recursos genéticos. Es decir, determinar si hay un usuario que quiera venir a obtener recursos genéticos en el país, el país podrá en su legislación exigirle un consentimiento informado previo. O sea, pídame permiso primero y espere mi consentimiento. Eso bajo el artículo 15 es voluntario. Los países pueden hacerlo o no hacerlo. Y el artículo 15 continúa diciendo: y al momento usted de regular el acceso a los recursos genéticos en su país, por favor, hágalo en que ese acceso sea una relación entre el usuario y el proveedor mutuamente acordada, mutually agreed terms. Ese es el MAT, términos mutuamente acordados. Es decir, que el usuario del recurso genético y el proveedor del recurso genético se sienten y conversen, es decir, y lleguen a un acuerdo sobre cómo se va a hacer ese acceso, cuáles serán los beneficios, qué pasa si nos peleamos, dónde se dirime esto, por cuánto tiempo se otorga ese acceso. eso debe quedar, repito, en un MAT. Para los que somos abogados aquí, piensen que ese MAT, esos términos mutuamente acordados, se refieren a un contrato, y así es como la legislación nacional lo considera, un contrato de acceso entre el usuario del recurso genético y el proveedor. También es importante señalar que el Convenio de Diversidad Biológica dijo, bueno, pero hay recursos genéticos que tienen conocimiento tradicional asociado. Es decir, que hay pueblos indígenas que tienen un conocimiento específico sobre ciertos recursos genéticos y ese conocimiento es valiosísimo. El usuario del recurso genético seguramente va a querer también beneficiarse de ese conocimiento tradicional asociado. Entonces, ¿qué dice el convenio frente a ese escenario? Dice, como es un deber del Estado respetar, preservar y mantener esos conocimientos, porque el conocimiento tradicional le pertenece al pueblo indígena, entonces el Estado deberá garantizar que no se acceda a ese conocimiento tradicional si no es con el consentimiento informado previo del pueblo indígena. Hoy en día se habla de consentimiento libre, previo e informado del pueblo indígena. Eso también quedó, esa base, ese fundamento del acceso al conocimiento tradicional asociado al recurso genético, también quedó establecido en el tratado. Y repito, para que los estados garantizaran que si se va a acceder a ese conocimiento tradicional, se deba hacer con el consentimiento del pueblo indígena al que le pertenece. Piensen que puede haber acceso a recurso genético que no tenga conocimiento tradicional, o sea, esto no se presenta sistemáticamente. Habrá circunstancias en que sí, habrá circunstancias en que el recurso genético está solito y no tiene ese conocimiento tradicional. Y obviamente, además del PIC, o sea, además de que se deba hacer con el consentimiento del pueblo indígena, también debe ser con beneficios para ellos, es decir, se les debe reconocer los beneficios por ese conocimiento tradicional que le aportaron al recurso genético. En Colombia hay que mencionar que los recursos genéticos le pertenecen a la nación, es un desarrollo jurisprudencial, es decir, la Corte dijo los recursos genéticos son de la nación, el conocimiento ancestral sí es del pueblo indígena. Entonces, en Colombia, nosotros emocionadísimos con esto de que el convenio de biodiversidad nos había, uno, eh, otorgado la soberanía sobre nuestra biodiversidad. Recuerden que antes era patrimonio común de la humanidad. Dos, que nos daba la potestad de legislar sobre el acceso. En ese momento, estamos en 1990 y recién adoptado el convenio, 1992, 93, 94, cuando entra en vigor, en Colombia se dice, hagamos esto ya, hagamos una legislación para regular el acceso a los recursos genéticos. No la hagamos solos, dijo alguien, hagámoslo con los demás países de lo que entonces era la comunidad andina, Venezuela, Colombia, Perú, Ecuador y Bolivia. Juntémonos los cinco, digo que entonces, porque hoy en día la comunidad andina ya no tiene a Venezuela, pero entonces en esa época, repito, éramos cinco, juntémonos los cinco y regulemos de una forma igual ese acceso a los recursos genéticos. ¿Para qué? Para tener un mayor poder de negociación, porque recuerden que la rana o la matica no reconoce la frontera, entonces pues de nada me servía a mí tener una reglamentación si el usuario podía irse al país de al lado, donde iba a ser más fácil, o una legislación diferente, etcétera. Entonces, esa fue la racional detrás de por qué lo hicimos los cinco países juntos. Esta es la decisión 391 de 1996, que sigue estando vigente hoy en Colombia y sigue siendo el régimen de acceso a los recursos genéticos en el país. Repito, lo hicimos en un contexto en que pensamos que esto iba a ser el oro verde. El oro verde. Iban a llegar cientos de usuarios a pedirnos recursos genéticos, a pedirnos celebrar contratos de acceso y nos íbamos a llenar de beneficios. Eso realmente nunca se concretó por muchas razones y distintas, diversas, en realidad esos millones de dólares en beneficios que pensábamos que íbamos a recibir no se concretaron. El régimen sí sigue ahí, es decir, un procedimiento bastante complejo de cómo deben solicitarse estos contratos de acceso en el país. No tenemos tiempo, obviamente, de abordarlo en detalle, pero sepan que pues hoy en día se ha agilizado de alguna manera después de años en que estuvo muy rígido y colapsado, pero hoy en día pues ya en el ministerio hay un trámite establecido para esos contratos de acceso. De la misma manera, a nivel internacional, los países miembros, los países parte del Convenio de Diversidad Biológica quieren regular esto también a nivel global, es decir, a nivel de todos los estados. Lo que les acabo de contar es la legislación doméstica, la legislación a nivel nuestro, compartida con la Comunidad Andina de Naciones, pero también con la Comunidad Andina. Pero aquí también las partes del convenio querían un instrumento que regulara lo mismo, el acceso a los recursos genéticos y la participación justa y equitativa de los beneficios. Designan a Tim Hodges de Canadá y a Fernando Casas de Colombia para que copresidan estas negociaciones que culminan en el 2010 con la adopción del protocolo de Nagoya, y un hijito del Convenio de Diversidad Biológica, y que hace precisamente esto que acabamos de contar, regular el ABS. Entonces regula en el tema del acceso. Obviamente el protocolo de Nagoya respeta lo que dijo la convención. Cada país es soberano de regular el acceso como lo considere en su legislación doméstica. En la parte de la participación justa y equitativa de los beneficios, establece entonces ese detalle, ese nitty-gritty, digamos, esa regulación de cómo se va a implementar todo esto que acabamos de mencionar. Y sobre todo el protocolo de Nagoya también se refiere a qué pasa cuando hay conocimiento tradicional asociado al recurso genético, cómo se debe solicitar ese consentimiento informado previo, cómo se debe dar los beneficios a esos pueblos indígenas que aporten ese conocimiento tradicional asociado. El tratado funciona básicamente con una obligación en la que el país usuario, el estado donde está el usuario, debe garantizar que el recurso genético que se utilice en su territorio fue accedido de manera legal. Piensen ustedes que básicamente es, si se llevan una ranita de Colombia para Francia y se desarrolla un suero antiofídico en Francia y se patenta y se empiezan a vender dosis de ese suero antiofídico, Francia, al momento en que se patentó o en algún otro momento durante la cadena, determina que esa rana es colombiana y que salió de aquí, que somos país de origen de esa rana, es quien debe garantizar que ese producto, es decir, ese acceso al recurso genético se hizo conforme a la legislación colombiana. Entonces, Francia, en teoría, tendría que mirar cuál es la legislación colombiana. Ah, un contrato de acceso, la decisión 391. Muéstreme, señor, su contrato de acceso para yo estar seguro que usted accedió de manera legal. Así funciona a grandes rasgos el protocolo de Nagoya. También tiene un mecanismo multilateral para beneficios de cuando el recurso genético es compartido, por ejemplo. Entonces, así se estableció este régimen de manera detallada en el protocolo de Nagoya. A la fecha, el protocolo de Nagoya tiene 141 países parte. Brasil es parte, y esto es algo importante que tal vez en las discusiones tengamos tiempo de abordar, cómo Brasil ha regulado el acceso a los recursos genéticos y al secuenciamiento genético, pero eso lo veremos más adelante. Colombia no es parte. ¿Por qué? Porque el artículo 7 y el artículo 11 del protocolo de Nagoya regulan todo lo que tiene que ver con el conocimiento tradicional ancestral, al conocimiento tradicional asociado al recurso genético o conocimiento ancestral, como también se le conoce en Colombia. Y se consideró que este protocolo debía surtir una consulta previa para poder ser ratificar en Colombia. Y pues aquí todos sabrán la dificultad que que conlleva realizar esa consulta previa. Llevamos 14 años desde su adopción y no ha sido posible hacer esa consulta con los pueblos indígenas para preguntarles, ¿ustedes quieren que ratifiquemos el protocolo de Nagoya? Entonces, ante esa imposibilidad, pues no hemos podido ratificar, y no hay ninguna posibilidad, si se lo están preguntando, de que se alcance a ratificar para octubre a la COP16, porque el tema de la consulta previa requiere de unos recursos muy significativos y de un tiempo. Y el tema de la ratificación, por su parte, pues requiere de un tiempo largo. Recuerden que tiene que pasar por el Congreso, por la Corte Constitucional, etcétera, para poderlo ratificar. Ya para terminar y darle paso a Dominique, quiero señalar dos tratados que también son relevantes en el contexto del acceso a los recursos genéticos. Entonces, ¿qué vimos durante esta mini charla? Uno, que el convenio previó en su tercer objetivo que debía haber esta participación justa y equitativa de los beneficios que se derivaran de la utilización de los recursos genéticos. ¿Cómo lo reguló? Dijo, cada país puede legislar como quiera en su casa, pero deberá garantizar que si hay conocimiento tradicional asociado, se le reconozcan beneficios a ese pueblo indígena y su conocimiento solo pueda ser utilizado con el consentimiento de ese pueblo indígena. ¿Qué hizo Colombia? Legisló al respecto a nivel andino, la decisión 391 del 96, en la que se establece que entre usuario del recurso genético y proveedor debe haber un contrato de acceso. Y el protocolo de Nagoya hizo lo propio a nivel global, pero nosotros no somos parte de esa reglamentación. Entonces, eso es lo que acabamos de ver. Quería, repito, sí señalar que hay dos tratados que son también relevantes en el contexto de este tema. El primero, uno de particular interés del gremio, de este gremio al que nos estamos dirigiendo hoy, de la producción de alimentos. La FAO, cuando ve todo esto que está pasando en el contexto del convenio de diversidad biológica, se preocupa un poco y dice, pero esos regímenes de acceso, ¿qué tal que sean demasiado complicados en términos de seguridad alimentaria? Yo necesito un acceso facilitado a esos recursos. Yo no puedo tener que negociar un contrato de acceso que en sus primeros años el trámite duraba algo así como 14 años. Hoy en día, repito, se ha agilizado mucho, pero justamente ese era el temor de la FAO, cómo para recursos genéticos, para la alimentación y la agricultura, no podemos estar sometidos a ese mismo régimen. Entonces, en 2001 se adopta lo que se conoce como el TIRFA, el Tratado Internacional sobre Recursos Fitogenéticos para la Alimentación y la Agricultura. Colombia no lo había podido ratificar desde hace 23 años porque el Ministerio de Ambiente consideraba que los recursos fitogenéticos para la alimentación y la agricultura eran lo mismo que los que estaban regulados por la decisión 391 y que había que someterlos al mismo régimen del contrato que ya vimos. Sin embargo, gracias a una labor muy cuidadosa de centros de investigación, de Agrovitsavia, en fin, de muchos actores, ya estamos a un paso de la ratificación. No falta sino lo que se conoce como el depósito del instrumento. Entonces, estamos pendientes simplemente de que se destrabe un concepto en el Ministerio de Ambiente. Una vez el Ministerio de Ambiente dé ese concepto sobre la conveniencia de depositar ese instrumento de ratificación, ya la Cancillería podría proceder a ese último paso y Colombia podría anunciar la ratificación del TIRFA en la COP16. Eso sí se podría hacer. El TIRFA dice, desde el comienzo dice, es es compatible con el convenio de diversidad biológica y se hace de manera armónica. Este tratado es armónico. Y ya finalmente, repito, para que puedan oír a Dominique, también hay otro tratado que se acaba de adoptar el año pasado, está abierto para la firma en este momento, es el tratado sobre la biodiversidad que se encuentra en las áreas internacionales, es decir, en la parte del planeta que no pertenece a nadie, en aguas internacionales. A esa biodiversidad también se estaba accediendo de muchas maneras, pero los países en desarrollo no, porque no teníamos ni el submarino, ni la tecnología, ni lo que se requería. Entonces, este clamor hace que se negocie durante 10 años, se demoró esta negociación, un tratado que, repito, finalmente se adoptó en marzo del año pasado y que regula cómo se puede acceder a esa biodiversidad que se encuentra en aguas internacionales, pero sobre todo cómo se va a hacer una participación justa y equitativa de los beneficios que se deriven de la utilización de esos recursos de la biodiversidad que están en zonas de alta mar o aguas internacionales, como se conoce. Entonces, no quería dejar de hacer referencia a esos dos tratados que también son relevantes y con eso sí le doy paso a María Andrea, que va a presentarles a Dominique. Gracias.
Buenos días a todos, Jimena, muchas gracias. Nuevamente, muy útil toda la información que nos has dado. Y procedo a presentar a Dominique. Dominique es abogado, estudió Derecho en la Universidad de Lovaina y Estrasburgo. Ha sido abogado del Departamento de Propiedad Intelectual del Bufete de Abogados Allen & Overy y hoy en día es el vicepresidente legal de CropLife International con un enfoque en biotecnología, protección de cultivos, propiedad intelectual y especialista en acceso y distribución de beneficios. Así que bienvenido, Dominique. Un gusto tenerte acá. Welcome, Dominique. Nice to see you and hope to have you soon here in Colombia.
Many thanks, Maria. Many thanks, Jimena. Many thanks to all of you for taking the time to listen to this presentation. And also thanks a lot for setting this up with such an excellent translation. I have to say it's not easy, I think, for the translators. And they do a wonderful job in doing all of the technical terms and the technical topics. I think it's really great and very convenient that we can do this. So thanks a lot. Thanks again, Jimena, also for the excellent overview of ABS and giving a very good, clear view, I think, on the concept of ABS and how all of that fits into the different, let's say, genetic resources that we are talking about, including in agriculture. What I would want to focus on is the topic of digital sequence information. So the digital component of biodiversity, which is currently a very hot topic in the international negotiations and will be a very important topic in the COP meeting, the Conference of the Parties, that will take place by the end of this year in Colombia. And so a bit of a recap.
Perdón, Dominique, ¿te puedo interrumpir un segundo? Y es para informarle a todos los que nos están escuchando que pueden tener la traducción simultánea si van al globito o al mundo que hay en la parte de abajo de sus pantallas. Pueden buscar el canal en español y van a escuchar la traducción simultánea para Dominique. Cualquier cosa nos pueden escribir en el chat si tienen algún inconveniente, pero hay traducción simultánea si van al globito que hay en la parte inferior de sus pantallas y eligen español allí. Perdón, Dominique, gracias.
No problem, no problem. Very important to point that out. So if we look at the scope, actually, or the material scope of this ABS framework that Jimena talked about, and she already talked about traditional knowledge in addition to genetic resources, then we see that there are different buckets actually of what is regulated by this access and benefit sharing framework and over which a country can then exercise their sovereign rights. On the one hand, this is the genetic resources, and that's broadly defined. It's any type of material of a plant, of an animal, or microbial origin containing a functional unit of heredity. It's also including the traditional knowledge associated with these genetic resources. And as pointed out by Jimena, this is a very important piece. It also includes derivatives, naturally occurring biochemical compounds in potential benefit sharing obligations. And as has been discussed for quite some years now, and has been decided in the previous COP meeting in 22, it is also now considered that in the context of CBD, the digital component of biodiversity and the benefit sharing related to that component needs to be considered and needs to be managed. And that is called digital sequence information. This topic has come up because certain countries have said, we always wanted to look for the green gold, as Jimena also said, because since we have sovereign rights over genetic resources, we can regulate access, we can regulate benefit sharing. The green gold has not really happened. And many have said, there is a certain lack in this framework because with new developments in science, we also should look at the data component because now and more in the future, the benefits and the value will probably be more generated by the digital component of biodiversity. Hence, this became a key topic in the discussions going forward. Now, as always, the world is always quite complex. The world of access and benefit sharing is also quite complex. And when we started to talk about digital sequence information, one of the things that is complex and complicated is the term digital sequence information. Now, this term has been coined at a certain point in time and still continues to be used as a placeholder. For years already, it was discussed, what is the exact scope of this term? Should we not use another term? And this has led to actually quite a lot of debates and discussions. But currently, DSI is still used as a placeholder in the negotiations. And although others, for instance, in the scientific community have said, maybe we should use nucleotide sequence data, or maybe we should use genetic sequence data as is used in other fora as well, like the WHO and also the International Treaty to a certain extent. Up to now, in the context of the Convention on Biological Diversity, we still use digital sequence information, and there is no set definition of what this entails. So it's potentially a quite broad term, including quite a lot of pieces of data or information. So that's the first thing we have to keep in mind, because some of you might ask the question, what are we talking about when we talk about DSI? So again, quite a broad term, a broad concept that is being used in an ABS context. As indicated, countries were stating we need to consider and we need to integrate the digital component of biodiversity, otherwise we might lose out on benefit sharing. But this created some additional questions on the access to data. And it became clear that in this debate on digital sequence information, we need to reconcile, on the one hand, access, and on the other side, benefit sharing. Why access? Because if you look at how science works, for many, many, many years, science has relied on open access and exchange of data. There are international frameworks set up, international databases set up, like the International Nucleotide Sequence Database, INSDC, in which scientists from the private sector and the public sector are actually accessing data and are exchanging data. And that has been happening for many, many, many years. So if we start to impose benefit sharing on this component, then this could, of course, have quite an impact on the open access and the open exchange. On the other hand, there was this request from the provider countries to address the issue of the benefit sharing. What is important to point out is that this is a topic in which it is important to secure the access and secure the value creation by scientists all over the world, in every country of the world, not only developed countries, but also developing countries. There's actually quite a lot of developing country scientists who are currently accessing and exchanging data from these databases. And there are even articles written about that. And secondly, it's also not only about getting benefit sharing obligations imposed on private sector companies, because it's actually relevant for scientists from the private sector, small companies, big companies, and relevant for scientists in the public sector, also academic scientists. So in that sense, we have to try to overcome what would sometimes be seen as a north-south divide, or as a private sector, public sector, big company, small company type of divide. In a way, we are all in this together as scientists and as societies, that we have to make sure that there is sustainable use of the data and exchange of the data. At the same time, we understand, or we all need to understand, that there is a request to also address the topic of the benefit sharing. And so that's why these discussions have resulted in what is called decoupling of access and benefit sharing, looking actually at a system that would not impact the open access and exchange. And that brings us a bit to the nature of the Nagoya Protocol, and that will then result in understanding how the Convention on Biological Diversity came up with this decision to establish a multilateral mechanism. If we look at Nagoya, as Jimena explained, the Nagoya Protocol recognizes sovereign rights of countries over their genetic resources. Means that a country can decide to regulate or not regulate, as Colombia has already regulated prior to Nagoya, the access and benefit sharing related to their genetic resources. This is a bilateral system. So it means that if you are a scientist, or if you're a company or an academic institution, wherever in the world you are based, and you want to access genetic resources from different countries, there is a complexity. You will have to understand and you will have to comply with all of these different countries and all of the different laws of these countries. And this has created quite some complexity already in the R&D activities. What we have seen and understood from scientists is that if you look at data and how data is used and exchanged, this has made the world even more complex. Why is that? Because there's a huge amount of data in public open access databases. Often access means that you are accessing many sequences at once. A scientist will often look at a very broad open-ended data set because that's where the value lies. Thirdly, and that's very important, the value of data science often lies in accessing and looking at the totality of all sequences. And these can come from 20 countries, 30 countries. And also there's a high level of redundancy in the number of sequences that you're looking at, and that actually code then for life or for the species that you are looking at. So this has made it very clear that if you would actually look at a bilateral system to also deal with access and benefit sharing related to data, that would not really be workable. And that resulted then in discussions and gradually an understanding that we should look at multilateral systems. I had listed some examples which clearly show why it is so complex. For instance, the Leibniz Institute sequenced 22,000 barley genomes from 80 countries. Genotyping of large-scale screening of 40-50 winter wheat lines, which was then included in a cooperation with 10 private companies, is an example. What is also important is that in the new techniques that we now currently see popping up, the novel breeding techniques, the gene editing, the data component and the exchange of data is of key importance. But what is also important to note is that the exchange of data is not only important for core R&D, it is also important for other types of activities like monitoring of farm pests and diseases. And then we know there's a bit of a discussion. What is the scope of utilization or use? We know certain national laws are quite broad, not only covering core R&D. Data, again, will make this more complicated and hence makes it more important to look at how can we secure the open access to data. And that actually resulted in quite a lot of discussions. And then finally, the decision at COP15 in Montreal in 2022, where they said, we understand that just using the bilateral system of Nagoya also to the data component of biodiversity will not work because of this sheer complexity. Because of the need to secure open access and exchange, we need to go to a system that overcomes that complexity, and we need to establish a multilateral mechanism. And that is what they did. So they took a decision in saying, we do establish a multilateral mechanism for benefit sharing. But of course, we are now in the period up to the next COP, where discussions are taking place, negotiations are taking place on developing and operationalizing this mechanism, meaning defining the modalities of how will this work, what are the trigger points, for instance, how are funds to be allocated. All these things are currently discussed, and we'll come back to some of those in the next slides. What is also important to note is that the Convention on Biological Diversity themselves have included in their decision a list of criteria. So they said, we understand complexities related to data, and hence we think that if we now develop the modalities of a multilateral system, there are certain criteria that need to be complied with. And these criteria are, on the one hand, quite obvious, but at the same time, quite challenging if you look at how complex these topics are. First of all, they say it should be practical and efficient. What is very important is that it should have a positive cost-benefit assessment. We know from experience with certain laws, ABS laws, that due to the high transaction costs, often these laws cost a lot of money, also for the public authorities, to manage all of these cases. They say a multilateral mechanism on DSI should generate more benefits than it costs. It should be effective. It should actually generate benefits. It should provide legal clarity and legal certainty for providers and users. And then very important, it should not hinder research and innovation. And that's very much linked to the consistency with open access to data. So this is recognized. It's recognized that scientists have the need to continue to have open access to data, exchange data, and that this is the foundation actually for the value that is being created through international R&D. They also include mutual supportiveness of other ABS instruments, and very important as well, and it links to what Jimena said, the importance of traditional knowledge and indigenous peoples and local communities. This is specifically recognized in the decision, that it should take into account the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. If we now translate that into what are the elements that are now being discussed in the negotiations, we can actually list 5 different elements under discussion. The first thing is contributions to the fund. And that's, of course, one of the most important ones. What are the triggers of contributions to the fund? Who are the entities that actually need to contribute to this fund? And I'll go back, I will go into a bit more detail in that regard in the next slides. Second point, disbursement from the funds. How do you deal with the allocation of funds? Are you going to allocate the funds to certain projects based on needs? And as we have said, since scientists around the world are using already data, are accessing data, exchanging data, there is also a need for capacity building. So this will be a very important part of defining to what you will allocate the funds. And then, of course, what is important as well, you have mega diverse countries, a mega diverse country. Colombia is a mega diverse country. They might say country-specific allocations are also needed because there is an incentive to ensure that these countries are recognized, knowing that they have a bigger chunk of the biodiversity in the world. A third point is the non-monetary benefit sharing. We talked already a bit about what could be a trigger for a contribution. There, a lot of the discussions is about a fee or payment of a monetary contribution. But as we know, in the context of ABS and explicitly recognized by Nagoya, in addition to monetary, there is also non-monetary benefit sharing. This can be funding for certain projects. This can, for instance, be setting up a cooperation with a local partner. This can also be elements of tech transfer, making certain data available. And so that's a very important piece as well in the discussions. To what extent should non-monetary benefits be included with an explicit reference, for instance, to the topic of tech transfer? If we talk about a fund, we have to talk about the governance of a fund. Where will it be set? How will it be set up? Will it be, for instance, included in the JEF fund? That is something that has led to already quite some discussions. What is important as well is that how you then deal with issues like transparency in the fund. Who are the stakeholders that you will include in managing the funds going into that fund? And then the last bullet, and that's a very important bullet, is the relation to other approaches and systems. We'll come back to that in a minute as well, because it's in this context that so-called hybrid options have been tabled. Also, Colombia tabled at a certain point in time in the previous decision-making process, so to speak, up to the COP15, a hybrid option. What is a hybrid option? A hybrid option would mean that you have a multilateral system, but that you also have on top a potential carve-out and still a system which is, for instance, more based on a bilateral approach with still safeguarding the national sovereignty actually over part of the digital component of biodiversity. And one topic that is important as well, and that is explicitly recognized by the CBD as well, is to what extent do we need to also address the topic of physical genetic resources? This is, of course, covered by Nagoya Protocol, is covered by national laws, is still in that bilateral system. If we talk about multilateral systems, do we also have to look at potentially even an opt-in of physical genetic resources? Brings me also to what Jimena said on the international treaty. For plant genetic resources for food and agriculture, the FAO decided to set up a multilateral system for physical genetic resources, which can then be accessed under a standard material transfer agreement. There are currently discussions on DSI in that context as well. They already have a multilateral mechanism for physical genetic resources, which means that in agriculture, if you do research in agriculture, for certain crops, you might, depending on the crop and depending on where the material comes from, already be subject to a multilateral system. For other types of genetic resources, you will then have to go to the country specifically. And that, of course, creates a bit of a layer cake of potential obligations and hence a complexity. So let's take a few minutes to dig a bit deeper into some of these points because they are of key importance in the state of play of the negotiations. And the most important one is the element of contributions to the fund. What we see is that currently there are different systems being discussed. There is a system that's being discussed where the payment is more happening at the start of your activities, your R&D activities, where you would, for instance, pay a fee, which is called a subscription fee. So you pay a fee, an annual fee, and that gives you a license to operate to then undertake research and development, including commercialization. Another system that is discussed is a levy, and a levy can take many different forms, but a levy, as discussed, is more at the end of the value chain. And one of the proposals that have been made by the African Union, for instance, is a 1% levy on retail sales. Other models that are discussed include things like a service fee, for instance. Now, what is important is that any type of payment mechanism should actually be quite simple. And it should be simple for all of the relevant stakeholders, for the entity paying, for the entity collecting, and for the provider country, because then you avoid unnecessary administrative burden. What is also important is that we are looking at a system that can bring substantial amount of resources. Hence, it's important to have a broad payer base to increase the potential to raise the funds. Fourthly, what is important is that the basis for calculating payments is straightforward, that this is not adding additional complexity, adding additional legal certainty or administrative costs. What is also important is that there is proportionality, because what we see in the discussions on DSI is that there is also the broader topic of resource mobilization in the context of the global biodiversity framework. But of course, what DSI brings is only part of what is needed in the whole world to deal with and manage biodiversity. Predictability is key. And what is a very important point is that any payment scheme should not actually be reliant upon a system of track and trace. And this is important because already in the decision, the CBD recognized that track and trace is actually extremely difficult or even impossible to do. One of the reasons to set up a multilateral system is to try to overcome a high transaction cost and legal certainty. So if you would come up with a system whereby a payment is, for instance, linked to commercial use of a specific sequence requiring track and trace, the criteria that need to be complied with would really be undermined by including this track and trace obligation in such a system. And what is important as well is that there is no payment stacking, in a sense that there is no additional payments to payments that already exist in different systems, which is of course also a challenge looking at the different systems that exist. So that is the important piece of how do we deal with the contributions and how do we ensure that when fees are being included, that they are not undermining actually the underlying value that's being created by an entity that is accessing data and using data. As indicated, governance of a fund is important. It is important because you also want to continue to have an incentive for entities to contribute to a fund and not criticize the fund because it is, for instance, not transparent or not accountable. So in the governance of a fund, there are a few principles that need to be complied with. There is the inclusiveness. Ideally, all of the relevant stakeholders are included. There is the transparency, that it's clear how it works, how it functions, that it's accountable, that it has integrity, that it has administrative simplicity is key, because otherwise it will start to cost too much in setting it up and in managing the funds. And what is important as well, that some people have pointed out already, is that we should look at DSI as only one category in the large universe of data that is already actually administered by data governance principles. And that's a discussion, I think, which is important in the context of DSI, in that we recognize these data governance principles that exist already, which are underpinning science, modern science, as we speak. And then the last part, and also a very important part, because it is really popping up in the negotiations, that is the fact whether other approaches need to be taken into consideration. And so we come back to these so-called hybrid approaches, whereby you would have a coexistence of national obligations with a multilateral system. If you build such a layer cake of obligations, then often this will undermine the reality of how data is used in research and development and in value chains. And this would add administrative costs. This would undermine legal certainty. The reason why it is very important to go to a functioning multilateral system, which is really multilateral, is that if you do not do a system which is fully multilateral, you will have a risk that the user will avoid DSI from countries which are imposing additional obligations and hence additional complexity. What is important as well is that in your product development, you want to have that predictability and legal certainty from the start on all of the data that you want to use. And the less data you can use, the less probability for innovation, the less benefit sharing. As indicated already, any need to track and trace should be avoided. If you have a hybrid approach, if you have a coexistence of national rules with a multilateral system, you will probably need to track and trace part of the DSI that you're using. And if you have to track specific DSI, you probably have to track all of your DSI. And that, as we know, is an impossibility, not only difficult or complex, but really factually and materially an impossibility. What we also know is that biodiversity does not recognize borders. And I think Jimena referred to that as well, in saying that biology, of course, we know many species are to be found in situ conditions in many different countries. So looking at multilateral systems make a lot of sense, especially the data components. And what is important that if you start to build a layer cake that is not multilateral in its core, that you would undermine the functioning of currently well-functioning public systems like the INSDC and other databases that exist. And the last bullet says, we should also consider to a certain extent whether the inclusion of physical genetic resources makes sense, potentially through opt-in systems, because we know there are other systems that are using a multilateral system, as we said, the international treaty, and this can create a further incentive for countries to have workable systems and to lower the administrative cost of using such a system. Also because, as scientists would point out, and I'm a lawyer by training, not a scientist, but scientists would point out that there is a huge interdependence between the physical genetic resource and the data, and you cannot really make a clear distinction between the two in essence. All of this is part of your modern use of biodiversity as a whole. So to finish, just give you a bit of a procedural overview of where we are currently in the negotiations. As we have said, we are going quite quickly to the COP meeting in Cali, Colombia, end of October. But as we speak, there are still a lot of discussions happening with regard to DSI. We had an open-ended working group, the first one happening in November last year. And pursuant to that open-ended working group, there is now a lot of additional activities taking place. On the one hand, there is information sharing happening. What is important is that there is an informal advisory group set up. This is a group with stakeholders, representatives of countries as well, to exchange information, technical information, to increase the knowledge of the topics. They're not negotiating, but they are important because they impact, I think, the discussions to a certain extent. And they have meetings once a month, so it's quite intense. They're informal consultations. And what is important as well is that there is now a draft study being set up actually by KPMG on revenue generating measures. So this study will probably be released at a certain point in time. What is important is that any study that comes out, any study that is actually, whether it's issued by the CBD or issued by other countries, it is very important that the data which are included there will give a clear and correct representation of value of what is being done, the value of sectors and all of that, because that will have an impact on expectations and the negotiations. And so that is very important to look at in all of these studies that might be coming part of the negotiations going forward, including then with the study that still needs to be made public and is not yet seen in this work. We see there is parallel work on ABS indicators happening as well, which is also a complex and difficult topic. And there is the next open-ended working group meeting in August in Montreal, which will be a key meeting to prepare actually for the COP and the COP16. And for completeness, it's important to note that also the international treaty and other fora are discussing this topic. So I acknowledge that this is a lot of information for those of you who don't follow closely the discussions, I think, on ABS and DSI, and I apologize for that. At the same time, it's a very important topic for all of us, because we all want to, I think, safeguard the value that is generated through science in the world, public, private, wherever it happens, on access to data and exchange of data. And at the same time, we are now I think, working towards workable system then of having this benefit sharing also recognized, which can reconcile the value creation and at the same time then also recognizes this need for the benefit sharing in a workable multilateral system in which all the countries are now heavily engaged, including also Colombia. So I'm going to stop there, Jimena and Maria. I hope it was not too much information. And we can then definitely open it up for questions, or whether people already have maybe included some questions in the chat. We are here to give some further observations.
Thank you, Dominique. And preguntas, bienvenidas todas las que sean. Muchísimas gracias, Dominique. Perfecta la presentación y muy útil.
Yes, Dominique, even for me, it was absolutely clear the way you presented the actual panorama, which is actually a very complex one, as you said. But let's hope that it all going to end well in Cali. I see a question. Sorry, I'm going to switch to Spanish. Veo una pregunta en el chat, es sobre cómo están abordando el tema de DSI los países andinos que no han ratificado Nagoya. Tal vez importante aclarar que todos los países andinos de la comunidad andina, si es a eso a lo que se está refiriendo la pregunta de Adriana, ya ratificaron Nagoya, Ecuador y Bolivia en el 2017, Perú en el 2014 y Venezuela en el 2019. Bueno, Venezuela ya no es comunidad andina. Entonces, el único que no lo ha ratificado es Colombia, y creo que Dominique pues ya presentó cómo estamos abordando el tema, o por lo menos cómo estábamos abordando el tema cuando se sugirió el enfoque híbrido. También sabemos que actualmente se están revisando las posiciones con miras a la reunión de agosto, con miras a la COP, siendo nosotros anfitriones. Entonces todo esto todavía es materia de discusión. Y con respecto a la decisión andina, de cómo aborda la decisión andina el tema de DSI, yo me atrevería, pero que alguien me corrija si no es el caso, a afirmar que la decisión andina no contempló DSI, porque es la del 96. Entonces todavía esa idea de esas bases de datos con la información de los genes, pues no estaba dentro dentro de la foto, por decirlo de alguna manera. Entonces, la decisión andina en mi entendimiento no incluye DSI. No sé, Dominique, if you want to add something about it.
Yeah, I think, Jimena, I think you're right. It creates a bit of a legal uncertainty, I think, because if you would read some of the articles, sometimes there are some people who would say, it's so open-ended that you could read it into it. And that, of course, creates a bit of legal uncertainty, because it's quite an old legal framework in that sense. So I don't think it's explicitly addressed, explicitly recognized, but there are some references, I think, to information in the legal framework, which at a minimum creates some legal uncertainty in that regard, I think, just to be on the safe side.
Thank you, Dominique. And there's a question from Isabel, which I think it's for you, and I find it very interesting as well. She asked, how are you going to align the requirements of the magazines when you publish something in scientific reviews, etc., open access, with the regulations that will be defined for the use and benefit sharing of DSI?
How to align it? Yeah, we know that already now. Quite a lot of articles, I think, or a lot of academic publications request some kind of a statement of compliance with ABS obligations. So that's already important. I think when we look at there is, of course, an open access to data. Does not mean that there needs to be immediately an open access of all publications. And there, I think it can be fully consistent with publishing and then also making publications publicly available to a certain extent. in line with how this is done currently. I don't think that is necessarily a change or needs to be changed in how currently academic publications are done. And I don't know whether it fully responds to the question. I don't know whether, Jimena, you have an additional point in that regard. I think in that sense, I mean, in principle, you would sometimes you publish academically. Some of these things are then made more broadly available as publications, maybe some other things less or not immediately, but that is not necessarily, I think, interfering immediately with the open access to the data components.
Thank you, Dominique. No, I couldn't add anything. I'm really not aware of the issue, but I think it's interesting. We're running out of time. However, with Maria Andrea's patience, I would like to take advantage of your presence with us today, Dominique, to ask you a little bit about Brazil open access regime, because it's extremely interesting from each point that you mentioned. So if you could like enlighten us a little bit about Brazil regime in a couple of minutes, if Maria Andrea allows, it will be great. Thank you.
Yeah, Brazil, of course, has uses the genetic heritage as the term in their national law, and this includes the data components. So they have in the material scope of their law already data included. They also say that if you would then have used that data component with a certain qualifier, whereby that data was substantially relevant, I think, for the development of that product, because they have that qualifier, then this could already entail in benefit sharing obligations. So nationally, their law will impose, under certain conditions, obligations on entities who have used DSI resulting from Brazilian genetic resources. That is also the reason why in the international negotiations, Brazil has been, for quite some years now, very active as a negotiator in saying we need to have DSI addressed, we need to include DSI in the CBD in the first place, and we need to make sure that there is a level playing field on benefit sharing internationally related to DSI. Because they have a national law, this is also the reason why they are, to a certain extent, also not only talking about the multilateral mechanism in the international negotiations, but they're also saying, okay, how can we, to a certain extent, recognize existing national laws? And so they are, at this point in time, de facto also looking at systems which are more hybrid, because you would have multilateral and then potentially still certain national provisions that are recognized. But I also understand that this is still very much a work in process and in progress at the Brazilian level, because they are also, I think, further working on their positioning in the context of these international negotiations. Because I do think that, as we've seen in Colombia was first a proponent for hybrids. I think certain changes have taken place, and probably this is still being discussed with regard to that position. The more countries and the more stakeholders listen to concerns, I think, from scientists around the world, also in their own countries, that if you build a system which is, again, this layer cake, that you could actually create a system with huge legal uncertainty and huge transaction costs. So the focus should be, and hopefully is, with countries also in having a really multilateral system with functioning modalities, and not really focus on still having a national system or having certain carve-outs, which could really have a negative impact, in my view, on science in the whole world, including also in Brazil. But that's, of course, an observation coming from the users in the first place. But so that's Brazil. In the national law, they have it in. They have not really, I think, generated a lot of benefits through the use of DSI under their national law, but they have it in, and it is covered through this concept of genetic heritage, and hence they play a very important role, and they're very strong in advocating for having the DSI, and at the same time now still a bit of a carve out of certain national provisions as well, potentially, with regard to certain parts of DSI.
Gracias, Dominique. Súper. Tenemos una pregunta más antes de terminar y ya los dejo ir. Y dice, teniendo en cuenta que Dice, teniendo en cuenta que la información digital que se obtiene a partir del término, dame un segundo. Ups. Teniendo en cuenta que la información digital que se obtiene a partir del estudio de los recursos genéticos o de los productos derivados contenidos en un organismo, por ejemplo, un microorganismo, es producto de la creación intelectual, un científico que además para obtener el científico se vale de instrumentos producto de la invención, lo cual conlleva tanto derecho de propiedad intelectual de tipo moral o de otro tipo, cuando son reclamados y otorgados por oficinas de propiedad intelectual. Desde el derecho internacional y el derecho a propiedad intelectual es posible reclamar un pago por el uso de esta información cuando ya está de carácter libre en una base de datos.
But the product itself will not be included in the open access database. It's the data that will be included. And of course, that data might be used in then developing a product. And if that product is an invention, complying with the novelty, inventive step, industrial application criteria of a patent, it could be protected by a patent, but it's not the same. The data in itself and the genetic resource for that matter as well in itself is not claimed nor claimable by IP. If, however, you have been using some of these things and you make an invention, then maybe that is claimed as IP. At the same time, you will still have your benefit sharing obligations then according to the applicable laws, whether it's an international framework or a national law. And both rights can exist next to each other, of course. And so I think that's the element there. There is, however, a potential conflict probably in a way that if the reach through of the public rights, the sovereign rights of a country go so far down the value chain that at a certain point in time, it almost conflicts with the private rights of an IP, of IP rights in a way, of the invention. But that's a very complex way of balancing these two rights. But in principle, data remains public. The data is used from a public database. It's not the data that you will actually make subject to your IP rights. It's not the genetic resource itself. It always needs to be a real invention in which these patentability criteria will need to be complied with. And the underlying data will continue to be open access and will continue to be shared by everybody in the scientific community. So I hope that answers the question there on the interplay between the data, open access, and the IP.
Yes, thank you, Dominique. I think we are done. Gracias, yo creo que terminamos. Vamos a pasarle una encuesta a los asistentes y les agradecemos su atención.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank Juan. Gracias a nuestro intérprete.
Y
Yes,
thank you to
thanks
the
a lot.
interpreter as well. Y
Yes.
gracias, Dominique.
Yeah, thank you very much,
Gracias.
Jimena. Gracias.
Pleasure to see you. Bye,
Yeah.
guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Muchas gracias a todos. Thank you, Dominique.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Maria. Thanks for the opportunity. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.